and welcome back to Beyond, where we are continuing to take a look at the AQA Power and Conflict cluster of poetry. This week we are moving on to take a look at Robert Browning's My Last Duchess. This was one of my personal favourites to teach in the classroom, and it still continues to be a favourite poem of mine. In this video we will consider the sinister nature of the poem's title, discover why Robert Browning set his poem in the Renaissance period, and consider the parallels that Browning drew between two societies that were 300 years apart. Now, before we take a look at the context of the poem, it's really important that we take a look at its title. Remember that the title is always the first thing we look at when we encounter a new poem, as it is the first indicator to us what the poem is about, its content and its nature. The title My Last Duchess might first indicate something of an ode or adulation of a duke's love for his previous wife. However, a closer analysis of the language reveals something a little bit more sinister. The pronoun my suggests ownership and possession. The Duchess is introduced to us as the duke's property. He is objectifying her right from the beginning of the poem. The adjective last, on the other hand, is a little bit more ambiguous. Some readers might interpret this as the wife he intends to live out the remainder of his life with, while others will interpret it as a reference to an ex-wife whom he is no longer married to. This then might raise the question of, well, where is she now? Eagle-eyed readers might even question why Browning opted to omit the Duchess's name in the title, yet this is the first indicator of the misogyny and narcissism of the Duke narrating the poem. My Last Duchess was written in 1842 by Robert Browning, and he was one of Victorian's foremost poets, admired by the upper echelons of society for his approach to writing dramatic monologues or using the form of psychological portraiture. This approach, possibly drawing on his experience of writing for the stage, introduced a new dramatic form of verse, where one character speaks for an extended period of time. Within My Last Duchess, this is combined with the ekphrastic form of poetry. In Greek tradition, this form of poetry meant to describe a thing in vivid detail. Yet, by the time Browning was thinking of how to engage his readers, it had taken on the meaning of a poem written about a work of art. And by writing in the form of dramatic monologue, Browning was able to really convey the narcissistic nature of the Duke. You may be wondering now why Browning would take the risk of creating such obscure verse, especially when the Victorian audience really enjoyed and were huge fans of things that were steeped in tradition. But he had to do something in order to make his poetry stand out and compete with the growing adoration for the traditional novelists like Charles Dickens and George Eliot. It wasn't even that the Victorians had turned their back on poetry altogether. They just weren't really that into embracing any new developments in the field of poetry. They were still happily turning their eyes and ears to romantic poets like Wordsworth and Byron. Perhaps they sought comfort in the familiarity of these poems when pretty much everything else in consideration around them was changing, and that is everything in society that was progressing at a really alarming rate. This, of course, must have been really frustrating for Browning and other poets of the time who wanted to experiment and push the boundaries, and it really was having a profound effect on their waning popularity in society. Browning had to think outside of the box. How could he appeal to this hard-to-please audience? How could he bring them out of this comfort zone to embrace new poetic developments? He found his answer in the writing of verse and prose that would alarm and even shock his reader. Romantic poetry had been all about emotional depth and sentiment with meaningful and flowery language. Browning's poetry, on the other hand, took a different approach, using psychological portraiture, which we mentioned before, to present topics like realism, misogyny, psychopathy, while adopting raw and harsh language. Luckily for Browning, this risk paid off. As mentioned earlier, he eventually became a much-loved poet of the time. In the writing of My Last Duchess, set in 1564, Browning turned to the Renaissance era. The Italian Renaissance period was something of particular interest to him, especially as he lived there during a period of his life. And he continued to research aspects of its history while looking for inspiration for his work. Browning most likely saw parallels in how women were treated in the Renaissance period to how some aspects of Victorian society were still treating females, objects to be owned and manipulated by men. While attitudes in Victorian society were beginning to progress with the growth of the suffrage movement, there was still a really long way to go, and this is what Browning is trying to indicate and acknowledge in his poetry. So when he presents us with the narcissistic archetypal character of the Duke, we can immediately acknowledge that he is using the poem as a thinly veiled critique of the male-dominated society of his own time. Much like Percy Bysshe Shelley with Ozymandias, Browning decided to hide this really strong critique by setting his poem in a bygone era. How could he possibly be criticising Victorian society if this poem was set in a period of time that was 300 years earlier? Not only this, if we take a look at Browning's own personal life, we could also perceive the poem as a thinly veiled attack on his own father-in-law. His marriage to Elizabeth Barrett, a famous poet in her own right, had to be kept secret initially due to the controlling and possessive nature of her father. Inspired by the history of Duke Alfonso II of Ferrara, indicated by the epigraph Ferrara under the title, and whose young wife died in suspicious circumstances, Browning obviously felt that he could draw parallels between how she was objectified by her husband and the misogyny of his own time that he strongly objected to. And while there is no indication that the Duke of Ferrara kept a portrait of his wife behind a curtain that he controlled, Browning did use the same narcissism, misogyny and psychopathy as a springboard for his own Duke. While readers might be shocked at the macabre nature of the poem, Browning used it as an opportunity to give us an insight into the psychology of a man obsessed with maintaining his power and control. That's it for today. Thank you for joining us. We hope that you found this content both informative and useful. If you would like a written form of the information shared in today's video, you can find it on our website following the link in the video description below. Join us next time as we begin to take a look at the form and structure of the poem.